Hallo Freunde, willkommen zurück zu .NET API Review. Es ist 10 Uhr, mehr oder weniger, on a day that starts with a T, which doesn't really work in German. Sad. Alright, wow, on the screen I can see that we actually, the 8.0 issues are becoming finite, which is impressive for this time of year. But today we will be talking, probably entirely, about system command line. So with that, so this is going to be a runtime issue 68578, and Adam, take it away.
Yeah, hello everyone. So as some of you know, system command line is a very popular library for parsing command line applications arguments. It has almost 17 million downloads on NuGet.org, and our goal for .NET 8 is to simplify the API, make it meet all of the BCL guidelines, make it performant and flexible for the more advanced users, and also build a base for a source generator approach that we are going to develop potentially for .NET 9. It's a very ambitious goal because, as I said, we want to keep it at the same time simple and performant, but also flexible. And When it comes to the features, system command allows for building a hierarchy of symbols. It allows for parsing the symbols. It supports completions and execution and validation and many other things. To make this proposal more successful, I have decided to divide them into groups, and I would like to discuss them by concepts. So not entire type at once, but just concepts. So yeah, so the first code sample is something that we might offer in the near future with source generator, where everything that I will be talking about today, namely arguments, options, commands, this will be transparent to the end users who are just going to write main that is going to accept some arguments. But to develop such a source generator, we need a good solid base, a library in BCL. So let's start with symbols. Symbols help us to create a hierarchy of symbols. CLI symbol is a base abstract type that every other symbol type needs to implement. It consists of name and description, and it can be hidden from help, from completions, and it can also have parents. CLI argument is an argument or a parameter with where we don't specify the name in the command line. So a good example of argument, for example, in ping utility, you specify the address without specifying the name, like -- address. You just specify the address. It's an argument. Jeremy, could you please scroll down? But we need to refer to argument when displaying help, and ideally in a localized way. So that is why CLI argument, the base abstract type for the generic argument type, defines a help name property. So for example, in case of .NET Build help, the argument is the path to the project or a solution file, and here the argument help name is project or solution. Yeah. CLI argument, the generic type, is a type that derives from it, and it's a generic type because obviously when defining CLIs, we don't want to use reflection at all. So we want people to define generic arguments. And when it comes to defining symbol hierarchy, everything that it defines is a value type. Sorry, it's an override of the value type property. The next symbol type is option. And to tell the long story short, option is an argument with a name. So for example, -- help is an option. It also has a help name. It has an arity, but I don't want to talk about arity right now. I should remove it and include it in the parsing part. An option can be also applied to all of to the entire hierarchy of the symbols below it. So for example, let's say that we create .NET SDK. It has plenty of commands. For example, build, restore, etc., etc. But we want help to be available for all of them. So instead of adding help option to each of them, we just add it to the root command and define it as an option that applies to self and children. Moreover, we can specify whether options are required or not. They are not required by default. And every option can have aliases. So for example, in case of help, it can be -h, question mark, whatever you want. When it comes to the return type for aliases, for now it's a collection of strings. But what is important here is that aliases, they need to be unique. They cannot be empty or white space. And this property is not returning a hash set because we need to control what people are adding. So we basically created a dedicated type that just wraps a hash set and performs the alias validation, namely not allowing for white spaces or empty aliases. And CLI option is a generic type that derives from the base CLI option type. And again, it's just a generic type. What's important that right now it has only a single public constructor. We specified the name in explicit name and an array of aliases via params, so they're optional. In the past, it was quite complex because people could specify the name or the aliases, and the longest alias was being selected as a name. Now everything is explicit and we have only one constructor. CLI command is a symbol that represents a specific action that the application should perform. So for example, .NET build is a command, .NET restore is a command. Commands can consist of arguments, options, and subcommands. And when we are defining a command, we need to specify the name. Commands also come with aliases. And to support nice duck typing in C#, namely the collection initializer syntax, where people can just add any symbols to a command. The command, that's why command implements IEnumerable of CLI symbol and an add CLI symbol method. Directives are a concept coming from system command line. It's not something that we have taken from POSIX. It's our own invention. And they come with a name and an action. But since we are just talking about building a hierarchy of symbols right now, let's just focus on the name. CLI directive, we need to specify the name and some examples of directives that we would like to expose in system command line is environment variables directive, which, for example, can be used to specify environment variables for the command line application. Another is suggest, which is heavily used by .NET suggest command line global tool. And last but not least, diagram directive. Jeremy, could you scroll a little bit? It basically prints a diagram of how the command line arguments that are specified to the app, how they are understood by the parser. Yeah. So this is the first part that I would like to discuss, building a hierarchy of symbols. Do you have any questions?
What is a directive?
John, I think my description wasn't good enough. Would you like to help me?
Sure. A directive is conceptually, you could say it's similar to an HTTP header. What we wanted to do was to be able to have cross-cutting concerns that could be expected to be present in a large number of CLI applications without having people without colliding with people's own CLI application grammars. So one example of where this is used is in completions. The suggest directive is used to signal that the rest of the command line should be, instead of being invoked, it should be used to return a set of completions given a certain position on the command line. So it's the syntax for directives would be, it's intended not to collide with things that are already out there in the wild. And so there's a very kind of restricted set of rules for it, which is that it's got to be bounded by square brackets and it has to be the first token after arg0. It can't contain spaces. Localization is another scenario for this, being able to specify languages in a consistent way. So it really kind of enables a tooling ecosystem that sits on top of this, where you can't, in cases where you can't expect command line apps to define consistent grammars, right? So we want to stay out of the way of the command line grammars that people define. That's the motivation behind the directive concept.
I don't know why that just jumped. Because for some reason it collapsed. Okay, but
I have made a very small edit. Maybe that's why.
okay, please don't edit the post while we're in the meeting.
Sorry, I wasn't aware of the fact that GitHub is smart enough
Well,
to detect it.
the host, at least, this time, I've already copied the whole thing out into a different editor, so any changes you've made don't show up.
Okay.
So please
Noted.
please don't edit the thing that is being discussed.
Let me do that so I can take the heat. I have a question, actually, about the CLI symbol type is marked as abstract, but there are no abstract members on it. All of the members are Git set. And you introduce other hierarchies of types that are built on top of it that are themselves abstract. I guess, why does the base type CLI symbol have a bunch of publicly accessible setters as opposed to having something abstract? Like, is the name property supposed to be abstract?
No. So it does not it has no setter, but it has a private protected constructor which allows for setting the name. So we don't expect the end users to derive directly from CLI symbol, but plenty of people derive directly from CLI option, CLI command, sometimes from CLI argument, and we expect them to derive from CLI directive as well.
Okay, but in the case of name, that is supposed to be a protected set instead of no set at all?
No, it's supposed to be a
It's read only. It's set only by the constructor.
Apparently you should have written private protected CLI symbol string name.
Does CLI symbol have an internal constructor?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So this one is hard to reason about, but when for anyone listening who writes API proposals, if you have a non-public constructor, you have to include it in the review because that says that the type is not instantiable or derivable. So.
Yeah, because if this has a protected constructor, then obviously people can subclass it directly.
You said a private protected.
Yeah.
So only he can derive it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And it is expected that the name is immutable once the object is created, but things like description and hidden are mutable, correct? Like that is intentional in the design here?
Yes, that is very intentional.
Okay.
And name is required because what we have added very recently is getting value from the parse result by using the name. And to make entire design way more simpler and, for example, avoid cache invalidation, we have decided to make name mutable.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so for is hidden, we can probably drop the is. I feel like we're inconsistent on ises. I don't have strong feelings one way or the other. And nobody else is chiming in, so.
I feel like we tend to use verbs like is for method names and not have them for property names, but you're right, I don't think we're consistent here.
Right, because a property name should be a noun. Right.
Adjective, yeah.
Well, Boolean properties tend to be adjectives, but this is name. Name is a noun.
Oh yes, sorry, name, not is hidden. Context switching, sorry.
Right. So is hidden should probably just be hidden.
And the use case behind is hidden is sometimes we want to introduce some changes to our parser. For example, we want to rename a command, but we still want to support the old one. So we just add a new one and make the old one hidden. So it's not suggested in help, not suggested by the completions, but it still works when somebody types it.
Wouldn't that just be an alias?
That's also possible.
Okay.
But sometimes you want a different behavior or something, and you just want to hide it.
Okay. And I took the in the copy that I can't show you because I don't have multiple monitors on this machine. I did note the private protected constructor on CLI symbol to show that this is a closed hierarchy.
Thank you.
And what does it mean to have multiple parents? Like, are you traversing the parent hierarchy?
Yeah, so you can define given symbol once, for example, an option, and add it to multiple commands. And in such case, it has multiple parents. Typically, it has only one.
Yeah. Are you returning a custom collection type off of that?
We are using yield.
Okay.
Because it's really not used internally by the parser as of now.
How are you getting the data? Is this something that came down in a constructor, or?
We are storing a simple linked list node in the CLI symbol. It's a private field. And whenever given symbol is added to the command, so we do command.options or arguments.add, then we are actually using a custom collection that wraps a list. And when an item is added, we are also setting the parent.
Okay, so you have internal access to register a parent, so it's not something that could be extended, but it works. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else have anything else for symbol?
Yeah, I'm finding it. The CLI command class. The constructor takes a name and an optional description, but the description is itself a publicly settable property. Should that parameter be dropped on the constructor?
Yeah, so Jeremy, could you please scroll a little bit up to the code sample? No, to the second one. Yeah,
yep.
slightly
working. It's
the ping command.
Just being a little laggy.
Okay. Yeah. So as you can see over here, we create a new instance of a command, and then we use the collection initializer syntax to add symbols. And it works because command implements enumerable and it has the add method, so we can add symbols to it by doing that. But when we are doing this, and this is a very popular syntax amongst the system command line users, we cannot use other properties to set values.
So you can't use list initializer syntax and property initializer syntax at the same time?
Yes, exactly.
Is what you're saying. Okay.
Yes.
And it's worthwhile to save somebody from writing the additional line of code that would be command.description equals something.
I believe it is, one of the a very popular feedback we were getting was that people had to type a lot of code to get something simple working. So I kind of wanted to compress the typical code.
Okay.
What would the name of such a property be that could be either arguments or options?
So command exposes a list of children, which is all of them, like arguments, options, and subcomments.
Yeah, because you could, returning up to here, if you wanted both object and property syntax, then unless you think this is literally the most common pattern and this is the way that you should go and you don't want the object initializer, you only want the collection, is if all of these are on, I think you have a named children collection, and if you just if somebody just then said children equal open curly and did this, then it would call add on the children. And then you could set the description and the hidden and the aliases and what have you, if you wanted.
Yeah. I know it's possible, but to me, like this is like when I have joined the project and I have been searching for samples on the internet to get a better understanding of it. It was a very common way of defining the symbols for command to use this particular syntax. So maybe it's a bit too subjective, but it's the existing way.
It's one of the things that isn't shown here yet, but it is a reason why people like to be able to define these in one shot is because it's very common to use the symbol object to then look up a value in the parse result. Mm-hmm. And so if you declare them using field or property initializers, then you kind of want to optimize for being able to do it all in one statement.
Right, but it's the question of that versus that. Like, by having the property or exposing the property that is itself collection initializable, like you now get both syntaxes together. And I realize I was showing air quotes, but I can't share my camera on Teams, so you don't get to see that. So I mean, if you think that the description being the most common thing to set, and you could also, since we're talking about this constructor, if you think that the pattern that you showed is going to be the 99 percentile, and you want to do optional parameters in the constructor for other things, so for description, the hidden, etc., then you could, or just define it as basically what you've done now and say if somebody wants hidden, then they pick which of the two patterns they want, and the other one they move to not using the initializer pattern. Because in both of them, you can just move it from the pattern to the imperative statements.
Yeah, and if there is desire in the future to add new members to the base type and to be able to initialize them, we could always use an options overload in the constructor, and that way you get the best of both worlds as well. But no scenario here is being foreclosed, correct? Like you have to call it using the slightly different syntax. But it sounds like the syntax here solves the majority use case, which seems totally fine to me. Like the scenario is possible to achieve if you do have a complex requirement. So I'm fine with that.
Okay, but yes, that was actually CLI command, and we're up here on symbol still. So.
For CLI command, the arguments, options, and subcommands lists are all editable.
We're not to
correct?
command yet. We're at symbol.
No, CLI command, we're still in symbols, right?
We're on CLI symbol. You're jumping like 4 page downs.
Oh, I thought that we were open for discussion on all the symbols. Okay, sorry.
I'm just trying, because my laptop's being laggy, I'm trying to go through and so the base class I think nobody else had any feedback on.
Okay.
So now the arguments. I assume that you're a split generic and non-generic so that utility things can talk about CLI argument without needing to know the T, but the people creating it, you want them to always have a strong T.
Yes, exactly. For example, command has a list of CLI arguments, the non-generic ones. And you can add only generic ones to the list. But when you retrieve them, they are the abstract CLI argument.
And why, since you don't use the T here, why is it generic?
So
is this the thing that'll like make sense later, or?
So, yes, it's going to make sense later because, you know, as I said, so it's only part of the symbols APIs because, you know, System CLI is a very big library, and I wanted to split these APIs into contexts. And when we will be talking about parsing, CLI argument and option, for example, they will have a property that is a custom parser which accepts something that you can parse and returns the T, a function. So it's not the complete API of these types. There will be extended in the next, you know, parts. Because I wanted to avoid the situation where we, you know, all focus on one detail, like it happened last time. For example,
but there will be somewhere something along the lines of get value of T takes a CLI argument of T and returns a T, or something. Where the like I'm just wondering where the T is going to come in the strong typing, because right now it's just as shown here, it's just being used to say what the type was. At which point you could just use type of. So
yeah. That will be that is going to happen in parsing, which will be the next part.
Okay. So CLI argument.
And CLI argument is also one of those classes that only system command line can subclass it.
So you can subclass the generic CLI argument of T.
But the non-generic one is not user overridable, correct?
Right. Okay. All the constructors are private protected, if I remember correctly.
Great. And
so I have to write it in brackets.
And for CLI argument of T, I would have the same question as last time. Like, is setting the description? So it sounds like setting the description was important on CLI command because you can't use both object initializer and list initializer syntax at the same time. But for CLI argument of T, that concern does not apply, so you can use regular object initializer syntax. So there's no need to take a constructor parameter. Is that correct? Okay. I learned something about a language today. It's great.
Okay, so ignoring later where you're going to have these things called directives, which are input by a user in a square bracket. Arguments are the things that in general help text are themselves shown as bare word or bare word in square bracket, right? I'm trying to understand argument versus object because your argument has a name, and I'm really wondering where the name comes in. So is this like
so
the argument would be like output file?
Because so the name, in case of argument, the name is not used for parsing. So for example, when you have ping utility, you are doing like ping and an address. You don't provide any name here. So the address is the argument. But in parse result, where you kind of want to get the value by name, you need to specify something to get the value of the argument. So argument name is not used for parsing, it's used for help and for getting values by name from the parse result.
Okay, so arguments are basically the positional slash unkeyed pieces of input.
Yes.
Okay. That explains why they have a name. Anybody else want to talk about arguments? Okay, options. My first piece of feedback is the applies to self and children is a weird name, and yeah, it's a weird name.
Yeah.
We'll start with that.
We are aware of the fact that it's not the perfect name. The previous name was global, but it was also far from perfect. So we are open to better ideas. And the meaning of this property is that it's part of the symbol tree, and the option is added to all of the commands below, to all of the subcommands. And a great example is help. You just add it to root command and you say, hey, it should apply to all of the subcommands. And that's it.
But help wouldn't be an option.
Help is an option, unfortunately.
But you used help as the example for argument.
No. But so here in the example, I wanted to show the output of .NET build --help, where it lists the arguments and it prints the help name of the argument, which is the project or solution file to operate on.
Okay, gotcha. So then, but help doesn't have a word that comes, or dash help doesn't have a word that comes after it. So I guess, is that a Boolean option and you say that it's true? That it was specified?
Yes, it's implicit. Like the value is implicit in case of help.
Is that true just because it's CLI option of Boolean, or is that yes, something that needs to be specified in the model?
John, please correct me if I'm wrong. CLI options of Boolean and of nullable Boolean, they are true by default. If an option is specified and the value was not specified, like true or false, then it's true by default.
Yeah, that's correct. There's a separate concept there which we touched on and glossed over, which is the arity, and it is derived from the type by convention, which works 99% of the time, but it can be specified differently in certain cases. But so for Boolean, that arity is 0 or 1. You don't have to specify true or false, but you can. But merely the presence of the token that corresponds to the name of an option or one of its aliases will match to true.
Right, but if you didn't want to support the syntax -- help false, would that be that you could make the help option with an arity of 0?
Exactly. Yep. And that is the way that it is implemented.
Okay, but that, I feel like Adam's edit was to get rid of arity, but it sounds like you've just explained why arity is needed.
Arity is needed for that and some other reasons, but yes.
Yeah, arity will be explained in the parsing as one of the first few concepts.
But it belongs on the symbol.
On the argument and option.
Right, but didn't you just remove it?
Yeah, I have removed it because I wanted us to focus only on building the hierarchy, and it's added to option and argument in the parsing.
Okay, so in wave 2 you're going to propose it as adding a member.
Yes, exactly.
And we're not supposed to view that as a failure of design, but a layering of presentation. Okay.
Well, the concept is there.
This is the assuming we don't finish today, and then you come back and you're like, oh, in this type we talked about, now we need to add another property to it. I'm just making sure, putting it in all of our heads that we're receiving this as pieces, and so that we can digest it instead of like, oh, right, we left the review and realized there were things we left out, which sounds like it wasn't ready for review. So I'm just
It's-
loading this into our head. So
Yeah, it's an interesting presentation style. Like I'm curious to see where this goes. But Jeremy, you had mentioned applies to self and children, and you didn't like that name, right?
well, because the problem
Um,
is self here is an option, so self is the wrong word, because self and this are, you know, synonymous concepts, and
because it
because the
always
self here
applies
is
to the self,
the
right?
self on this is the command you've bound it to, which
Yeah.
isn't
It's parent.
correct. And the option presumably has no children. So you're speaking on this as if it's the command, but it's really the option. And
Yeah.
so,
Well, you could say something like applies
That's-
recursively.
yeah.
Yeah, that's the actual meaning, because we were talking about help, which is quite unique because it's it has an action, but it basically applies recursively to the owning command and its subcommands.
Then would applies recursively or is recursive be appropriate for naming?
I believe it is.
Or just recursive.
Well, if we have is required, then I would probably opt to keep the is prefix for all these types of properties.
Well, I mean, we can just say that we're globally removing all the is's.
Sure, if we want to do that, that's fine.
So applies recursively sounds very good to me, because just recursive, no. I'm not a native speaker, but my first thing in my head is like a recursive method, like and it applies recursively. Yeah, I just prefer to have the applies prefix.
I do too, primarily because it's not that the option itself is recursive, it's the thing that the option is affixed to has a different behavior when this property is set.
Yep.
So yeah, it's not a property of the option, it's something that the air quotes reader has to interpret and do something about.
Exactly.
Okay, so applies to self and children. That's on option.
Yes.
In YouTube chat, they're recommending the word propagates. I'm not quite sure if I like that word, but it is an option.
Yeah, I mean, in all cases, whether we're saying applies or propagates or whatever, they're all a little-ish wrong, because the option doesn't do any of these things. It's telling the interpreter the way that it should treat it. I don't think we need to put a should on this one. It doesn't really seem to need it, but the yeah. So
yeah,
to me, applies and propagates are about the same. I also think it's fine to say that this is, quote, a recursive option, which means that recursive would be true. And what is a recursive option? An option that applies at the level it was declared and all sublevels. And so that's really saying we're applying the adjective recursive to this option. So I think recursive is a totally fine property name.
Is the argument that all of them are kind of a lie to an extent? So if none of them is technically the right thing, then just choose the one that's friendliest?
Yeah, but then getting rid of the applies or propagates or whatever and just saying recursive is because now you're describing the option as a recursive option and not describing what someone's supposed to do with that, which is why I like it a little better. It's less of a lie. Like,
Okay. Yeah, I could.
because that's where on the hidden,
see
right?
that.
Like, is hidden is more of you're describing a little bit of a state, saying like something somewhere hid this. It is hidden. You're describing the world, and otherwise you're just saying, oh, this is a hidden option, where hidden option is a kind of option, and so hidden is just the attribute that it either has or doesn't. And in this case, I think recursive is an attribute it has or doesn't. So I
That's
think
fair.
I think just
I can buy that argument.
recursive, public bool recursive is the most appropriate name here to me.
I like that argument better than the argument that Adam and I presented earlier.
Yeah, and it solves the problem of which prefix we should choose, like applies or propagates. And as Jeremy, as you said, you do option.recursive, so it applies to the option.
Yeah. Okay, and a piece of tech maybe failure. I have a weird error bar over chat. Is the last chat in YouTube still a suggestion of what I think it says propagate to children, because I can only see the top like 3 pixels of each letter?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm monitoring chat.
Okay, I thought it was still working, but I have a error bar on top of it now. So
Yeah, I'll speak up if someone says something.
okay, and then I think we already talked about is required, just changing to required,
Yes.
dropping the is. I'll write that down. Is required, went to required. Okay, where'd the browser window go? Where'd the right browser window go? Alright. And then... Alright, so aliases you took here as a... Or you're taking in the instantiable type as a params. It's also collection, so you can specify them late.
Yes.
And you already said... so CLI option dot aliases is a custom collection type. Is a private custom collection type.
Yes, which is basically a hash set that
So that
also
interface
validates the input.
is correct. Yep. Just every time there's an interface on a property, you're starting from a position of being wrong, so I'm writing down that we discussed it and decided it was right.
And the only alternative here was, instead of exposing I collection, we could expose I set, which would, kind of say that, hey, this collection is unique. But but I collection also implements contains and add. So I'm not sure whether.
But so does set, right?
Yeah.
I collection tends to be a more familiar interface. I would probably stick with that. Because you're not really expected to do set operations with it. You're expected to basically add to it and enumerate from it.
Right. So it's set is a collection that also supports intersection, subset, etc. And yeah, so I don't think you care about doing set math. You just care about being a non-duplicate supporting collection.
Yes, and in our validation logic, we are actually taking advantage of the fact that it's set internally, because, for example, when we are detecting collisions, duplicates for the aliases between various options on the same command, we are actually, using overlaps to see if, given two options have overlapping aliases.
Yeah, that's fine as an implementation detail.
Yeah, but so I think it's Sub-bullet, discussed iSet versus iCollection, and feel iSet is not appropriate. Okay. This one. Boom.
So another question I have here is the only class that you have that subclass CLI option is CLI option of T, correct?
Correct.
Doesn't that mean that you should have a value type property here, just like you have with argument?
Let me make a quick check because.
Oh, and then I think both CLI argument and CLI option, are you doing protected constructors or private protected constructors?
Private protected.
Okay.
And Levi, getting back to your question. We don't expose it from option, and that's because internally option is using an argument to store most of its information, and anytime we want to get the type, we are just doing option._argument, and we have the information.
Yeah, but what about public consumers who don't have access to your internals?
So far, we haven't received such a feature request. John, do you remember anything like that happening?
I think that will actually, it's a really good call out. I think that will become very apparent the moment we try to build the source generators. That we will need this.
Right, because if you're saying that the difference between an argument and an option is an option has a prefix keyword, then it does seem like you would want the value type to also be on option.
Yep.
Okay. I'll see all
But
that.
so far, when I was assigned to simplification of system command line, my rule of thumb was, make sure that we don't introduce an API that we want to remove in the future. It's better to not include something and just have one more API review in, let's say, in a year from now and add a property, rather than, introduce a property that we would regret in the future. So that was my strategy here.
Oh, and I think that's generally a good strategy. But it also makes things like asymmetry. Like, why does one class hierarchy have this and another class hierarchy not have it more apparent? Because if you've already identified a need for it in one hierarchy, then is it reasonable to assume, like I think John had said, that there will also be a need in the second hierarchy for it?
Yeah, because I don't want to name the idea, because the best I'm coming up with is CLI data. But it really seems like argument and option kind of should share a more intermediate base class, and that's where the value type thing would have lived. But given that it's going to be hard to name, I can see we just kind of make them look the same. Plus option then gains the extra data that goes on options.
Yeah, I have actually given it a try a few months ago, but I have failed to get it working. I don't remember why exactly, but I can find my old PR with some summary of why this experiment has failed.
Yeah,
the experiment of adding a value type property to CLI option?
No, make CLI option derive from CLI argument.
Okay.
Well,
Got it.
I was going to say right now you have, and I'm talking with my hands even though you can't see it, you have CLI symbol as the base layer, and then you have two types deriving from it, option and argument, and it really feels like you kind of want a CLI option or argument that is saying these two things behave very similarly until you get to now you need to pick, is this an option or an argument? But that feels like we're defining, there is a hierarchy there, but it's hard to name, and it doesn't seem doesn't seem like it'll really necessarily provide a lot of extra value. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially
not worth
since we
defining.
already took the argument name, so maybe it could be like
right, because you could have like CLI argument, and then it's derived by CLI option and CLI named argument. No, because option is named argument. So you could have
yeah.
unnamed argument and named argument deriving from argument, but that feels like we're giving up on maybe the best names just so we can have a middle layer, which, unless you have a need for it in code, doesn't seem justified. Like to say that this part of the parse tree wants things that are not commands, and if it's right now you can say it's not commands, but what you really meant was options or arguments. And so if it's worth saying, well, options and arguments together are always a special layer in a parse tree, then naming it and typing it does seem useful. But if it's not, then it's not. I'm just rambling. So
Yeah.
where was I?
And just a side note, there used to be an interface that they were both implementing, and it was actually defining value type. But in my process of removing everything that is not necessary, I was able to move it and have all of the packages that rely on system command line working. So.
Yep. Yeah. Every now and then we add something. Okay. So that was option and option of T. So
I have one more question on option of T.
Okay.
This is so. Option of T takes params aliases as a constructor parameter, which is asymmetric from argument, which takes description as a constructor parameter. Was that intentional?
Yes. So in the previous round of API review option, CLI option, I believe it had 6 constructors. And yeah, and one of the constructors was accepting a name, another was accepting aliases, and it was choosing the longest one as a name. So here I wanted to combine this information in one place, like you specify the name and the aliases, and later you can add some more aliases.
Levi, argument didn't take description, that was command.
Sorry, command, yes.
Because command has the children problem.
Yeah.
So
what I'm wondering is if you see CLI command and CLI option in your code reviewing, and you see constructor calls, or you're just writing it, like will you naturally be inclined to try to pass a description as the second argument into CLI option, and as a result observe incorrect behavior at runtime?
That's a very good question. We were actually, so aliases, they cannot contain white spaces, so currently you will get an exception during creation time.
Well, you'll get an exception at runtime. Yeah, not
yes,
compile
yes.
time.
yeah, but
it's a very good point.
if you're using this as the CLI for your application, whether it's manual or generated, this is the first time you hit F5, it tells you that your tree makes no sense.
Right.
So, yeah. I believe params methods require an array allocation, even if you don't specify inputs, which means we should probably make the constructor that doesn't take them so it can cascade the null or the empty.
I think it used to be true, but at some point Roslyn added an optimization that is passing array.empty of string when no params are being specified.
Okay.
You can
Also,
copy paste it to a sharp lab because you have it open.
This occurs once at app start, right?
It would be once per option per app start,
Yeah.
or once per time that you build a subtree because you're doing weird subtree things. But like if you're doing late bound interpretation, I'll just take your word that it works.
Yeah, I'm actually testing it in Sharp 5 right now, and yep, they use the array.empty singleton.
Okay. That may have been, in fact, what actually made it get added in API.
Yeah, I had a strong focus on performance when I was working on it.
Okay. So CLI command. So I guess again, children, you're doing IEnumerable because you're yield return here?
Yes, and to be honest, I'm not 100% sure whether we should expose this property because CLI command already implements IEnumerable of CLI symbol to support the collection initializer syntax.
Yeah,
And
I'd still leave it because while you're doing that to support a constructor thing, it feels really weird to me to just see somebody write, for each CLI symbol in CLI or in command. And you're like,
yeah.
But if you say in command.children, it's really just an alias to help people's brains mold themselves around that. So really, it's basically doing return this, right?
It's basically iterating over arguments.
Right. They're both getting the same.
Options.
They're both getting the same collection.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess the better way would say that the get enumerator that is being returned from the implicit or explicit implementation is returning the children enumerator. So uses yield return. Equals okay. All right. Arguments. You're now iList. We've not seen iList before. So why are you iList?
Yes. The reason for that is that when an argument is being added to the list, we also set its parent to the command. So it's another custom collection that wraps the lists, and whatever you add, we also set the parent.
Right, but I guess in particular, it's you also, or you care about doing insert and the other things that lists do that collections don't. Okay.
Yes, that's true. Sorry, I didn't get it.
So arguments and options are both non-public types, so the interface is the best you can answer.
Exactly. And in the past, we were just exposing add arguments, add options, and add subcommands methods, but later people started asking for a possibility to remove, clear, iterate, so we just decided to expose collections according to your guidance to them.
Sounds wonderful. Obviously very sage advice. All right, so I assume the same with subcommands, and now I'm going to have my brain both say that the C in command should be capital and that it should not. So somebody please just yell at me and say it should not.
It should not.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I guess, again, so we know aliases is going to be the custom hash set type. We know that, or I assume subcommands. Do commands need the same ordering that options and arguments do? Again, so list is what you want here versus just enumerable or collection?
Yes. So when it comes to commands, I don't think that people were asking for this in particular, but I just wanted to be, consistent with arguments and options in case somebody wants to do similar things in the future.
Okay. And yeah, so Levi, I know you had something that you'd wanted to talk about here with collection. Did we already cover that?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, with command, not with collection. Too many words that start with C.
Yeah, and these lists are mutable, correct? So yeah, so iList is a correct case.
Yep.
A command can't be its own child, correct?
So it's possible, but I don't see a scenario when somebody would like to do it. You can have other commands as your children. For a great example is .NET add, where we have .NET add package or project, and add is one command, and project or package is a subcommand of the add command.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but even if you had something weird like .NET package add feed add whatever, those two adds should be different commands, which means you could, during your add on the subcommands collection, check reference equality for wait, you're already in my parse tree, and then reject it.
Yes.
Yeah, I asked, like, it might just be, kind of an interesting test case scenario, but the more I mull on it, the more I think it does not actually affect what they've mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's maybe room for the throw in that one, and then there's maybe just room for telling somebody if they wrote a recursive thing, it may spin forever, and
if it hurts, don't do it.
Yeah. All right. So now we're back to this concept I've never seen in any other command line parser, so your directives.
Yes.
So directives are symbols that don't have help text?
Yeah, they don't.
Because I think I had a discussion thing of, do all the types have a help name? Because if so, they should promote it to symbol. But so this one does not have a help name.
That's correct.
And so, or where did the directives go?
That's a very good question. They go to config, which is discussed later as part of parsing.
Okay, so these are part of the parse tree, but the
sense.
object that contains them is in the future.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that they make sense only on the root level, because they need to be the first thing provided in the arcs.
Okay. And so I guess, just as a high-level question, if you're saying that the first thing, if it starts in square braces, is a directive, does that mean that you don't allow any of your commands or options or arguments to use the square brace syntax? I guess so. It would be the commands or the options can't use square braces.
They can.
They can. So you just say it didn't look like any of the directives you could have passed, so you must be the command.
Correct. Yeah. And directives are only valid in the first position in the parse command.
Right.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
if you had square bracket suggest close square bracket as a command, or ignore your root command and have no subcommands, and you had an option named suggest that you wrote in square braces, that would be lexically ambiguous between the option and the directive.
No, it's right. We don't have rules about prefixes, and so it's really just an exact string match. You could declare an option or command with square brackets.
Okay, but I guess this comes back to the if it hurts, don't do it. Of don't support a suggest directive and a option named suggest both in your totality command.
Yeah.
So if the CLI directive class takes a required string name as a constructor argument, I would assume that diagrams suggested environment variables all pass well-known constant strings as that argument?
Yes, to the base constructor.
Okay, so diagram takes more options. So what's the reason for having environment variable and suggest as public types if they're just a name?
because as the end user, you might want to enable or disable them. So for example, we are currently discussing which directives should be enabled by default. And since suggest directive is used by .NET Suggest, it's definitely one that has to be enabled by default. But for example, we are not sure whether we should enable environment variables directive by default. And so we actually prefer to just make it public and let the people add it to the config if they want it.
Right, but if it's only allowed to be at the root of an object and you're only using it as an input object, should it, and it's being used as signaling, should it have a singleton?
I see.
Like if you want to say environment variables is well known, like because if environment variables took a filter of what environment variables it's supposed to support, or I don't know where you're supposed to get the data out of what environment variables were being used in the nested key equal value syntax, because it's not showing up here. So presumably there's some parse tree equivalent of I saw an environment variable directive and here's your environment variable directive parse. Yeah, if it had more data, then it shouldn't. Then it's obviously customizable and shouldn't be a singleton. If it has a zero argument constructor and has no properties on it, it seems like it should have an instance property, so everybody can just talk about the one.
Yeah, and when it comes to that, we typically use singletons for improved performance, but system command line is typically used at the application startup only once. So actually introducing a static singleton could cost more than just creating it once.
Fair, but I guess it's if you get your tree result and you're looking at the directive, I guess you would just say you would actually use the old is. You would just be like, if directive is suggest directive, and because all that you cared about was that the type was suggest directive. Again, I'm trying to figure out how people are going to consume it.
They will just add it to the config. So they will basically do something like config.directives.add new environment variables directive. And that's it.
Okay, so the match model is going to have a different way of talking about directives?
I'm not sure if I understand.
If I'm writing a tool, then presumably I want to do something if the suggest directive was asserted. Right? So I need to know if it was asserted. So how am I supposed to ask if it was asserted?
So we have an API for that in parsing where you can ask the parse result whether given symbol, including environment variables directive instance, was provided or not.
Right, but so presumably it's going to come back and say that here's my parse result like dot directive, which is going to be null or not null. But then now you need to know, was the directive suggest? So is somebody supposed to match that by name, or are they supposed to match it by type comparison, or what? What's the recommended way to match that?
Okay. If I remember correctly, currently for directives, we only allow for getting that when you specify exactly the same instance. So you do basically parse result dot get value and you pass an instance of this directive. But so far nobody wanted to customize environment variables directive. People typically want to customize help, parsing errors, and other things for which we have mechanism. Like more user-friendly mechanism.
Okay, so
you can do it by name, for example.
So you would need to save. So you would need to save suggest directive into a named data container somewhere. Well, you would need to save it into a data container somewhere that you could reference again later, and then ask the parse result: is the directive equal one of these things that I saved?
Yes, and later in the execution, we also introduce the concept of action, and such as directive has an action property, and it returns an instance of an action type that, in case of this particular suggest directive, it's a suggest action. So you can do parse result.action is suggest action, and then you know that it's, if you invoke this parse result, then you are going to deal with suggest.
Okay, so that goes. So there is the mode that you're expecting that people will do is suggest directive as an input type, and then they're not going to talk about it again later. They're going to talk about instead the action.
Yes.
Okay, because that goes back to my should this be a singleton? Because if you're doing only reference matching on it, then why are you making someone hold the name reference when we could just hold it in the type hierarchy? But okay, I'm convinced enough. And I assume that the
that's why they can't be singletons.
Oh, I guess that's true because you could keep rewriting the description and having fun with that.
And all the other mutable properties that we haven't yet reviewed that hang off of it.
Right. Well, directive introduced no mutable properties, but symbol did have some. So that's.
Directive introduces a mutable property that hasn't yet been reviewed because it's under one of the other tabs.
Yeah, it's only
Fair
one
enough.
property, the action. It has the default value that the action that we provide, but users can override it.
Right. Okay. So again, in a later iteration, this would look more obvious as to why it can't be or shouldn't be a singleton. But when I'm
Yes.
seeing just this, my brain says, why in the world would anybody create a second one?
Yeah, and as I said, performance is very important to us, and system command line is unique in terms that it's used only once per process lifetime, typically in 99% of the scenarios. So I was actually removing all of the singletons and static caches because, they were more expensive to create and maintain rather than just, create something once.
Sure. Okay, so is the constructor parameter here on diagram directive really the right place for that value? Of what should the exit code be on a parse failure?
So it's for parse failure when you are using diagram directive. So
I guess who's handling it, who's reading it, and why isn't it exposed back out?
the execution is taking it, and when it's invoking the action, and it turns out that there is a parse error, it sets the exit code to the value provided here. But that's true. It's possible to set it. It's impossible to get it with the public APIs as of now.
Right. So diagram is expected never to be handled by an application?
Yeah, that's how I see it. John?
Yeah, so diagram and suggest and these things they're kind of intended to be, you can think of diagram as a little bit like a dry run. It's intended to be something that's generally available for people to be able to use, right? To verify, for example, that the parse tree is the way that they expected it to look, or that the parse tree does or doesn't have errors without actually invoking the command. So I don't expect that people would need a custom implementation of it. But we did. This came from a customer ask of being able to specify error codes so that the error code wouldn't collide with other error codes that they already had in their program.
Why is it an error code as opposed to an exception? Like, is system.command line actually calling like exit?
Yes. Well, it's
really
it's not calling exit. It's returning a code that you are expected to return from your main method. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It
So
doesn't.
so actually, when you parse, you get parse result, and there is a possibility to invoke it, and it returns an integer, which people can use an exit code of main, or for testing, or for whatever.
It's just an int that's passed back that you are expected to be able to use as an exit code. It doesn't set the exit code or call application exit.
So it's really a parse error return code.
Yes. Or not.
I would recommend maybe making this constructor parameterless and just having a property that is error exit code against that property.
Well, but it's not an exit code because you're not calling exit.
Well, it's the exit code that would be returned.
Well, right, but then you can just call it return code.
Sure.
Yeah, but then we have two concepts, and people will typically use return code as an exit code.
Okay. I mean, I guess we can call it an exit, but if the whole thing is that this is the return value from a handler that would do this for you automatically, and you're supposed to return it from your main, then it's what you're supposed to return. So it's really a return code and not an exit code. The fact that exit is called by the other main is a detail. But I'm fine. I don't care. It's wrong, but not wrong enough in my head.
Well, so when you were saying that, were you talking about the name or the fact that it's a constructor parameter? Because that latter part is the one that I'm
the name.
About.
So I'm saying instead of error exit code, in my head, a better name is parse error return code. Of what's it going to return if the tree has a parse error. But
I don't have a strong opinion about this. You're right that we are not using exit directly, so in theory it's not an exit code, but people typically use these values as exit codes. So, and one of our goals was to kind of try to simplify the naming and don't introduce more concepts that we need. So exit code is something that everybody understands, or most people understand.
Sure. It's just the thing that's weird to me is when someone calls this, you're forcing them to think about what they would do in an error case. And error cases tend to be, exceptional as opposed to something in the common path.
Yeah. So if exit code is going to be used as a property later in the hierarchy, then using the same noun is fine. My concern is because this is the only time we've seen it, that leads to things like Levi's question of, wait, is this calling exit on my behalf? And so if it says return, then it's not, because it's returning something. But so it's really, again, a question of if something in the future is going to talk about exit code as a property, then, and this is going to set that, then it makes sense. But if you don't have something like that, then I don't think this should use the word exit. So, do you have something like that?
Kathleen?
I was just say, adding to that, we don't set the exit code. We don't set environment.exit code. So I think I agree with Jeremy. That's it.
So let's change the name.
Okay. And then, Levi, you wanted it to be a getSet property instead of a constructor parameter?
Yes.
Does anyone want to object and keep it as a constructor parameter?
What default?
It could default to whatever you want it to be.
Okay.
So if you have the property default would be default error exit code, just like you have right now.
All right, cool.
My main argument for moving it out of the constructor is that it's very odd to me to force somebody to think upfront about what the error situation might look like.
Although I will say that one of the major purposes of this directive is to deliberately hand it bad CLIs in order to ensure that the messages you get on a bad CLI are the correct messages. So I agree with you, but that's just a little bit of nuance on how this is expected to be used. Yes, it'll be used in correct cases, but it's also very important when you're just trying to make sure that you've got all of your broken scenarios making sense to the end user.
Sure, and is it very common for somebody to want to change the error code?
No, that I don't think is common. No, I completely think the default will be used in the vast majority of cases.
Yeah, then at that point I would say like it's the scenario is possible and the syntax is just use a property initializer. But yeah, I would rather move it out of the happy path.
Yeah.
I agree. Let's do it.
Okay. And all right, so do I want error return code, error return value, parse error return something?
I think your best suggestion to me was parse return value, parse error return value.
Okay.
What is the API name where you actually get this return value? Like, is it hanging off of a property on like parse result or something?
Yes. Currently it's parse result.invoke. We are not sure whether it shouldn't be called execute or run. It's parse result.invoke as of today.
It's the
Like
return value of that.
Oh, okay.
I just put in the chat what Jeremy said earlier.
This was
Parse error return code was the earlier.
exit code.
We are almost done with the symbol part. I don't think it makes sense to start with parsing as of today, especially that you wanted to discuss some other API. But one thing that I wanted to ask you is that previously we have introduced this proposal with no CLI prefix. So we had symbol, argument, option, command. We have decided to go with CLI prefix. And do you think that it's a good prefix? So far, nobody complained about it during this meeting, but I just wanted to make sure that you know that it's there and it's okay.
I can't think of a better one, and I think it's better to have one than not have one. So it is the best names that I can come up with. You're being awfully silent there, Emo.
Sorry, I have too many mute buttons here. No, I'm typing an email right now, so I actually did not pay attention to anything you just said. Sorry.
Guys, I need to jump off the call because, maybe there is a fire in the next building or something like that. Sorry.
Okay, well,
Be safe.
yeah, be
That's a weird
safe.
way.
Be
Bye.
safe, don't burn.
That's a good reason.
Bye, Adam. He had raised that this round of the proposal has introduced a prefix on all the single word types of CLI, and asking if anybody wanted to remove or replace that prefix. And my response was, I don't want to remove it, and I can't think of a better one. Because I think that these are way overreaching if they're just single word types, like symbol, option, argument, and directive, and command.
So I agree with that. I think we need another word to qualify them. I'm not sure that CLI is the best way to do that. But I agree with you that I can't think of something off the top of my head right now. But I would say, depending on what the namespace is, I mean, command line is a bit on the long side, so command line symbol might be a lot of typing. But you could think of something like that, right? Command or something to that extent, right?
Yeah.
Command symbol, command directive wouldn't be terrible.
Well, but then you'd be command command.
Yeah.
And
I'm not saying command is basically the problem with CLI is like if you basically have an abbreviation and one of your core types is a prefix, that's not necessarily ideal. But we have done it in other places.
I mean,
like X document comes to mind, right?
Exactly. HTML node.
I mean, HTML is a bit of a. I think there's a difference between CLI and HTML in terms of like, nobody ever says, the long form of HTML and everybody treats it effectively as a noun. I think CLI is a bit more of a techno jargon that I don't think people use that much. But it certainly degrees, right? Like, it's not like, oh my God, we can't ship this, but it's also not like, I mean, I think there's some aesthetics that I think is not clear cut, but it does look a bit ugly too. Like the combination of L and I is not great in lowercase versions.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if it was the abbreviation CL for command line, then that would just feel very, Hungarian typed and would be wrong.
Absolutely.
And I mean, we could expand it to say it's command line symbol, command line directive, but I don't know that in my head, CLI and command line are rough synonyms. And
it is
Levi told me to jump in. That's why I'm jumping in. I don't mean to be rude, but when we did the work on this, okay, I'll just add a couple of things. So command line actually has a little bit more ambiguity in the community. There have been more things called command line than have been called CLI, actually. So we have a little bit more possible human logic confusion with other tools in the community. And the other thing is command, I think, also has a little bit of confusion with other uses of the word command, including, it's just a more common word. It's just a word that might appear somewhere else. And so we landed on CLI as something that wasn't quite as ubiquitous as database, which falls into this. We use the abbreviation even though the word would be used when we speak it out loud. It's unlike HTML. We say database, we use DB. We think it's in that category. I would agree it's not quite as common as database. But that's why we landed on it, just for a little bit of background. And I'm happy to listen to alternatives. The work we've done so far leads me to believe we will not find anything we're any happier with. And I also think command line's too long for people to have to look at. Anyway, a little background. So I'm going to suggest that if nobody comes up with a better idea, maybe we go out with that in preview and see if we can, see where we go from there. I do not want to go out in preview with option and argument. I want to go out into preview with disambiguation. And I would like to settle that today if we can, so that it does go out in preview. And, this is obviously a search and replace for people currently using the API. They'll have a lot of other changes too, so I'm not too worried about it. But I don't want to dribble out all these other changes and then come back with a big search and replace problem.
Yeah, so what I wrote down in the notes is we all agree there should be some other particle and not just single. Basically, there should be more than one capital letter in these types. And nobody has a better name, so CLI it is. Okay.
Thank you for helping us finalize that today. That was one I really wanted us to settle with.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly there may be late suggested names that you feel are super better, and you feel like renaming it before it ships, which is fine. But for the purposes of saying there's something and it can move forward, I think CLI is a good enough name, and nobody else is objecting. I mean, Emo gave his but he didn't seem to want to hold things up. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for helping to settle on that. We actually timed that well because this was something I was super passionate on settling today, and Adam didn't have as much more stuff as he did, of course, on everything else. So, I don't know about the fire drill, but hopefully everything is fine there, and that is was not actually a fire.
Yep. Okay. Does anyone else have anything else to share on the symbols aspect? All right, so to briefly summarize, we got rid of all the is prefixes on properties. We discussed all of the places that properties are using IEnumerable, iCollection, or iList, and all of them seem justified in context. We're going to accept Adam's word that CLI argument and CLI option that the generic T is going to matter in a later round. We renamed the unwieldy applies to self and children to recursive. And we renamed diagram directive the error exit code constructor parameter to parse error return value, and then made it a get set property instead of a constructor parameter. And we discussed the CLI prefix. And I can totally spell the word exit. Exit.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for making time for us while Adam was still out. Thank you.
So, emo, procedurally, what button should I push? Because they have 4 other phases of this. So, are we saying they come back as they need to move those into separate proposals? Or...
I mean, just from a tracking standpoint, I think, yeah, you want an issue to be about a single thing, and you can at some point close it off. So I would say if you have 4 stages, make 4 issues, and then we can discuss them as 4 individual steps, right?
Okay.
So Jeff and John, can you communicate that to Adam, please?
Will do. I'll take care of it.
Thank you.
Other 4 phases should be opened as 4 separate issues to be discussed individually. Assuming, well, I guess, yeah. Every time it's an atomic component, having it be a separate issue, even if we manage to slam through all 4 of them in one session, it gives us the option of having the individualized comments and breakdowns. So. Okay. Hearing no other words, I will mark phase 1 as approved. It happened. Boom. Okay. We have 14 minutes left. Yeah. Nothing in chat that we didn't already cover. So there was discussion, which might have been from this top issue, but I think we were told that we wouldn't have the people at this time.
Yeah, Lammy, or do you feel like you've got enough to cover this one, or should we wait until Tuesday when Eric and Eric can be here?
Yeah, we should probably wait. Like, yeah, I can't speak on this one right now.
Cool.
Okay, I will accept shouting nominations for a 10-minute issue.
The stack trace one seems fine. I think that should be relatively easy to talk about.
Yeah, literally the next issue.
I think it's just a constructor. Not sure the same amount of the core can talk about it, but I just happened to read it yesterday and it looked pretty straightforward. So basically we have the stack trace class, right, that just you can instantiate a stack trace today. Usually you just pass in the bool, right, to actually get the actual stack trace, and you can basically get the frames, right? And now I think the idea is you can create a filtered stack trace. And so the constructor is one way of doing it.
Yeah. Should it take an array or should it take an IEnumerable that it two arrays?
Yeah, this is the kind of thing we can decide, right? Another option is instead of doing that, you could imagine we just have a filter method, right, that produces the new thing as well, right? Because clearly you start off with a stack trace, because I don't know how else you would get frames. You're not really creating the frames by themselves, right? So that's the other option you have. Let me actually verify what I just said.
Because as proposed, where it's holding on to the array, it required that the caller make the array, and then B, we have the good old ownership problem. But if we say it's taking IEnumerable and two arraying it, then that means that you can say new stack trace of, filter to desired frames, which can be a yield return iterator that is keeping things in or out. Or you just say dot skip 3 because you're wanting to pop 3 frames off.
Right. I think in general, when you take an IEnumerable, I think you should make it clear whether you snapshot it or not. But I think it's a common thing we do in the BCL, right?
Yeah.
So I think taking an IEnumerable would make sense to me. It might result in double copies though, right? That's the downside. Right, because if you already two array it and then be able to array it again, right? But that's the
indeed. But
way
it's
this works.
I mean, that's the problem whenever we have things that take arrays and want to hold on to the data late. Is it reading the contents or is it holding the reference? And
yep.
So does it support late bound mutation or not? And most of my dev work has been in the security space where you never want to trust anybody to still have a reference to your inside. So security is always copy. Here may decide sharing a reference is fine, but
one of the reasons I actually like the idea of taking an IEnumerable is because if the scenario for this is filtering, then it means you could just make a very simple link expression and then pass the result of the expression into the constructor, and it would just work.
Right, and that was my earlier expression.
Yeah.
Especially showing the way that they used it here. They called a filter to desired frames, which is then doing its own go count the items and allocate them and whatever, whereas we have a built-in to array, which I guess honestly this one can't call to array because we never call link methods from low-level things, but
because I mean another thing you could do is instead of having a constructor overload that takes a stack frame array, have a filter method on stack trace. It takes a predicate of stack frame and returns a new stack trace object.
So the only question I have is regardless of how we design it API wise, is what is the resulting experience, right? So you take a stack trace, right? You filter out every other frame, let's say, and now you're basically just calling toString or something, right? So now, is it obvious to me when I look at the result that there were skipped frames? Because I mean, on exception objects, there's a way when we do this, with remoting, maybe say, I don't know, client frames come here, and then maybe something's got omitted or something, right? But if you just remove every other frame you printed, are you now seeing code that doesn't connect, or?
That's already the case today, because you can already hide stack frames from a stack trace today.
And the experience is literally just hidden. There's no indication in the output.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cases where stack frames get hidden is if a method gets inlined, and then that when looking at a stack trace, I at least often get confused of but this method didn't call this other method that threw the exception. It's yeah, well, welcome to.
But that kind of makes sense, right? Because that's just you look at the runtime, right? When you walk the stack, it's well, there was no stack frame, right? So it's kind of like when you debug optimized code, right? That to me, I mean, it's not great, but at least, there's nothing we can do about it, right? Here you basically provide an API for people to, arbitrarily slice things away, and then there's no indication that that happened, right? And now you see these impossible traces in your code, and it's like, how did I get from here to here? What happened in between?
But the answer is like, don't do that. Like the typical example is when people call, say, reflection, and then reflection is invoking a method on your behalf. Like, people normally like all of the reflection goop filtered out. So
Right.
even though method A didn't directly call method Z, like, you can kind of understand what happened.
I think that's fair. I think maybe that's also something we can do later. I think the API proposal is innocent enough. If you make it enumerable, that seems pretty much in line with what we do elsewhere. Stack frames you can actually create out of thin air, as it turns out. So with the constructor approach, you could literally create a stack trace by hand, which doesn't seem bad.
Yeah, that seems fine. And it sounds like we like the idea of a constructor overload better than like have a apply filter method directly on stack trace. A constructor overload would be more flexible.
Yeah, well, because
Yeah.
You could have some reason to know that there are frames that you want to inject, and if the only thing that we support is a filter, then we'd be coming back with, I want to be able to give the entire synthetic approach,
Right.
or I want the filter to support replacing something with a list of something, and like, I think just saying, you know what, build whatever you want and give it to us as an IEnumerable, and we'll deal with it.
Yeah, and that makes sense, because I imagine we had talked here about removing stack frames, but like Emo said, creating them out of thin air is also a valid option sometimes. If you want to concatenate a remote stack trace and a local stack trace.
Right.
We have APIs internally to concatenate these strings of those stack traces inside exception when exceptions are getting rethrown, but it doesn't recreate the stack trace object itself.
Right.
And this would allow you to do that. Okay. That sounds good.
So then basically we would have a constructor takes IEnumerable, it's always copying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And then whether the constructor wants to filter out null entries, throw an exception, whatever, just choose a behavior, document it.
What does the API do that takes a single frame? Does anybody know?
That is an excellent question.
Like it automatically walks starting from that frame? I guess that's what it does, right? What else would it do?
Nope, it literally just captures that frame and that frame alone.
Puts it in a new that just has the one object.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's stack trace that takes a single frame.
Yeah.
I mean, that's odd. Like, when would you ever have a single frame in it? I guess that's kind of when you do task.run and you want to say, like, you started here. So your root expression is the thing on the stack?
I guess.
There,
Some notion of, like, I want to tell you this piece and the rest of it you're not allowed to know. So.
There are scenarios for
I guess.
especially in exception handling, just capturing like the topmost frame, because that's really the only thing you really care about. But normally you would pass the number 1 to the constructor because you don't actually have a stack trace instance at that point yet.
Well, I thought passing number 1 is skip 1 frame and then capture the rest.
Yeah, that's what it does, right?
I thought there was an API that like actually found things.
Because the only one, I feel like it has a constructor and it's the number of frames to not report, and that's basically how deep is your
Oh yes.
how deep is your current error handling code so that you can capture the stack trace
No,
from back
you're
there where it
correct.
should have originated. So
Yes, you're correct.
okay, so instead of taking an array, we'll take an IEnumerable, make a draining copy, set the count correctly, etc.
Yep. Why do we store the count separately? Isn't that like whatever underlying array dot length? Why is that? Maybe I'm asking the wrong question here, but
I would guess it's so that they could do over alloc, and they're really just being their own implementation of list.
oh, I see.
That's a guess.
Sure.
So the array array length could be bigger than the count. All right.
Whatever makes us happy.
Yep. Yeah,
I bet that might be due to the fact that I don't know how they're computing which arrays get elided from that array, but they might compute the total frame count up front and then simply not add elided arrays while they're iterating. So that would be the over allocation that Jeremy just mentioned.
yeah. Or that the one that takes a number it just calls the thing and captures all of them, and then just tells itself, start at count minus length, when iterating, or something weird. Okay, well, we got through command line and another thing.
So I have one technical question. So next week the series expires. So we have one more meeting next week, and then the series for Thursdays is expiring. Given that our intake is lower, so basically if you look at the number of 8.0 issues that remain, it's basically going down, right? So should we just let it expire and then add it back when we need it? Because right now I think once, fully be done with the backlog, 2 meetings.
I
The
mean,
incoming rate doesn't seem very high.
well, there are a lot of things marked as ready for review future, and I don't think we want that to go infinite, and it still seems like we're at several page downs.
Yeah, I guess that's
we have-
fair.
We have at least 3 pages of stuff right now. I think if we got it
That's
under
hard to
2,
appreciate.
then we could say we can go back to 1 a week. But
Could this be a forcing function to get us to do proper triage and say, like, if it's not marked 8, we won't review it?
I mean, that means that we're now running into API reviews notion of what milestones mean versus what the leads for planning want milestone numbers to mean. So I don't think that's the right answer.
That's
mean-
fine.
And we can also anticipate probably a couple more Thursdays worth of command line dedication too. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true. We bumped command line off, but it's probably 4 more sessions, so we have 4 more full meetings of command line. Probably. I mean, maybe the rest is all simple, but let's just base it on the past.
We've gotten through the simplest parts.
I mean, there's a technical question, right? So if I just look at our issues here, we have 39 issues that are API approved that are not in that are in the future milestone. So if we approve more future stuff, like, does it just mean we approve stuff that by the time we actually get to it, we change our minds, so we have to review it all over again, or is this actually just feeding the pipeline, right? So basically what I'm saying is, like, are we wasting time reviewing stuff that we don't look at for the next 2 years, or are we actually doing something about those? That's the only argument to not look at it, right?
That is an interesting question. Are you ignoring ones that are marked as up for grabs?
I just looked at
Or
issues
help
that are
wanted, or whatever we
open
call it now?
in the repo. I would say, actually, let me look. I can actually group it by this as well. Group help wanted, right? What is
I
that
don't
group?
think there's very many.
Okay.
But that's what we could ask area owners to go apply help wanted to ones where if it got approved and a community contribution came in, that we would have the bandwidth to potentially bring it in this year.
Yeah, help wanted is about a third of the ones that are approved in future.
Okay. So, yeah, I guess Jeff is the only member of management that I see on the call. I think that we would like to suggest to you that people who are marking things ready for review as future are maybe doing something approaching wasting the time of this group, and that there should be questions of why there are so many things in this state. And it could just be that the thing was future and it got discussed and now it got marked ready for review and they just didn't adjust the milestone as we would do it in 8 if it gets approved. Or there's the what people want to do versus what they realistically have time to do, and there's all sorts of reasons, but maybe we should know what they are.
The vast majority of it would be stuff that we would consider, bottom up work coming from the backlog that got into this state, but is not something we're able to commit to. So, yeah, I'll take action on this to figure out how we want to manage it.
I mean, one option we have is we could just basically have an artificial cutoff and say anything that was marked API ready for review, that is older than, let's say, 24 months, we just move back to API needs work. And then somebody has to look at it again and decide, is it still relevant, right? Because
maybe
my concern is when you design something from like 2 years ago, chances are the rest of the stack has moved on. Either we don't need it anymore, or if we wanted it, we want it to look different because we have better features on the platform, right? So like, it's just like, is it really in the shape that we want it to be, basically?
Well,
right?
that's if it's been approved for that long, not ready for review.
Well, I mean, the same is ready for review, right? Because presumably you have a design idea, right? But then 2 years later, like, is that design still accurate? Like,
maybe.
Is it still something we would actually want to propose?
Maybe, but I would be, given the new filtering of how that things show up based on how long the label has been, it would be weird if, like, oh, we would have gotten to your issue today, but we didn't, and now we bounced it back to you, and now you go to the end of the list. What I think many of these things could possibly, and again, what we need is data, they could possibly be things of, once it got approved, it would go as help wanted. And maybe many of the things that are approved and not being acted on are help wanted, just don't have the label. And so I think we need to get squared out of, was it ready for review because we did it because of community, and now we need to tell the community they're allowed to do it? Or did we do it because we thought it was the right thing to do, but we also don't think it's important to do? And if so, we should stop reviewing those.
Yeah, I mean, right now we have nothing that is that old, right? Like the oldest we have is 13 months, right? So that's
okay.
I think that seems like to suggest that that's okay, right? But when we get to a point where the thing is like 26 months old, it's like, well, the design really still relevant?
Fair
I
enough.
don't know. But I think for the approved one, it's the same thing, right? Like if it's something approved 3 years ago, like, yeah, I'm not sure that's the design we still want. I mean, maybe yes, but that's like the approval should have an expiration effectively. I think that's the general way we think about it.
That seems fair to me.
My proposed action here then is, let's not plan to start API ready for review future. We won't proceed with those by default, and I'll seek a mechanism for area owners to annotate issues as, yes, it's future because we're not committing to it for 8.0, but we'd still like to go ahead and get it approved so that it can be acted on. Fill in the blank. I don't know how to finish that sentence, but I can get you an indicator.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between, I guess, vNext and, no milestones or future, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's super nuanced, and maybe we don't want this, but yeah.
It's either vNext or help wanted, which could just be help wanted. So, yeah, I think if we make the statement, by default, we will not proceed into API ready for review future. I'll get you an indicator for ones that should still get reviewed.
Well, I mean, but that goes back to the question of should emo renew the series or not, or should we drop to Tuesday only? But I think at least until we get through system command line, we're probably staying with the 2 per week.
I mean, I'm fine with saying, like, if something has milestone none, it's effectively saying not for 8, but the next one, right? Future to me indicates we looked at it and we said, like, well, maybe at some point, but not in the foreseeable future.
Too
right?
many of our other systems prevent us from keeping milestone in T.
I was gonna say now you're running into like the
Ah.
Jeff Schwartz yell at people if they don't have assigned milestones on things. And,
Fair enough. Then maybe we want the next one then, I guess. Or I don't know what else to do.
I'll get you an indicator.
I mean, if we just ignore future, we only have 10 open issues, basically, right? So that's basically what I was trying to say, is if we ignore those, then I think it's fine to let the series expire and then say we do only once a week until we see it's more. Because, I mean, it is an expensive meeting, right? Like with 30 people for 2 hours.
Indeed.
Maybe not 30, but like 10. So I mean, I'm not opposed to doing it. I just, if the devs want more time, I think that's a way to get it.
Yeah, I think my recommendation would be go ahead and extend it, and if we find out in the next week or two that we need to not extend it, I think it's easier
I'll
to
do
cancel it than it is to add it for people.
That is true. I'll do that. All right, then see you guys later.
Okay.
And Mo and Jeremy, by the way, I tagged both of you on a PR to update the docs with the link to the stream because it was stale.
The link to the stream? What do you mean?
In the .NET Runtime repo, there's a doc that describes the API review process.
Since
and the link to YouTube was.
Since we're talking about things that don't matter to the stream, I'll go ahead and say thanks everyone for joining us. Cool. And since we're over time and now we're talking about the business of how we do meetings instead of the business that goes on in the meetings, we're going to call it here, and we'll see you at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel Tuesday, because no matter what, we're still meeting on Tuesday.